Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Between Two Worlds. I am your host, Annika, and you are tuning in to this week's episode all on animal materia. The history, the folklore, the practices of using really such rich materia for your craft. But first, thank you for listening in and thank you for the ongoing support, especially on Patreon. I have lots of things planned over there. They're depending on, the tier. We explore anything from divination deep dives, folklore, recipes for oils, charms, etc. Talks on necromancy and even a curated spell or ritual each month. So please, if you have a moment after listening here to pop on over there and have a look, it would be much appreciated. But for now, let's talk all things animal. So before we get started, I will have, a disclaimer and mostly ethical section here in this conversation because it is very, very important. But this episode is for entertainment purposes only. So don't go off trying to gather weird shit by non-legal means. And I am definitely not telling you to go scoop eyeballs out of roadkill or making toads spit in your cauldron or anything of the sort. But for the witch, there has not only been this history of it, but a weight of using this sort of animal materia, right? A certain weight to working with bone, with fur, with teeth, blood, even the quest itself to find the exact material that you need from, I don't know, let's say heart of a cat to the poison skin of a toad. It sounds very theatrical and performed, but isn't that what we do when we embody the witch in ritual? Of course, we will talk ethics, right? I believe all witches have no true desire to harm these creatures. We have this deep understanding for life and its potency. And when using such materia, we should always, always be approached with morals and ethics first. So we live in this culture that has worked very hard to separate us from the reality of animal bodies, from our bodies, from the fact that we eat them, well, most of us, that we are made of the same stuff they are, that death is, part of the cycle that sustains all of us. The squeamishness that, some people feel around animal parts in magical practice is, I'd argue sometimes a symptom of that separation. Um, Obviously, there are other reasons, like if you are vegan or if you just your own ethical beliefs and practices. But, one of the things that working with these materials can do, what really it has always done in traditions across the world, is reconnect us to that reality, to the fact that we are animals, that we live in a world of bodies, that the sacred is not somewhere else unattainable, but here within the flesh and bone and blood of the living world, we can manipulate, barter with, use, and harness the spirits of our friends or foes for our own magical means. So let me start with a question that I think is the right place to begin. Why does this work? Not in a metaphorical sense, but why does it feel meaningful? But in the actual logic of magical practice, why are animal parts understood to carry such power? Of course, there's theory there. What is that theory? Well, there are actual several theories, and they're worth understanding because, they'll shape everything else that we choose to talk about today. So, of course, let's start with the basic logics of sympathetic magic. The one more particularly articulated by James George Frazer in The Golden Bough, specifically his two laws of sympathetic magic. So, the law of similarity, which is like produces like. This is something that is very well understood within the magical world, and also the law of contact. So, things that have been in contact continue to affect each other after separation. Fraser was writing in 1890, and his framework has been, of course, criticized, refined, and complicated by a century of anthropological work since then. But as a starting point, as a way of understanding the basic logic, this is extremely useful. So under the law of similarity, working with, say, a wolf's tooth gives you access to wolf like qualities, that ferocity, protection, the capacity to defend territory. The tooth is like the wolf. It carries the wolf's nature in consecrated form. Under the law of contact, a bone that was, say, once a part of a living animal retains a connection to that animal's life force. So to whatever animated it, whatever made it a wolf or a bear or an eagle rather than simply a collection of calcium and protein. The bone was in contact with that life and it carries that contact still. So, a quote from Fraser directly is: "If we analyze the principles of thought on which magic is based, they will probably be found to resolve themselves into two. First, that like produces like, or that an effect resembles its cause. And second, that things which have once been in contact with each other continue to act on each other at a distance after the physical contact has been severed." Now, this foundation quite obviously appears in various forms of really virtually every magical tradition we can come to even think of. Sure, the specific cosmologies differ along with the specific practices, but the underlying logic that the part carries the whole, the contact creates this connection, and ultimately that like affects like is the key. So, other than just the basic effects of sympathetic magic, I think the doctrine of signatures is worth a mention too. So, the signature of the plant or animal reveals its purpose, suggesting that the creator or nature itself provides clues to this healing, that the natural world is legible, that the appearance and behavior of plants and animals and even minerals tells us something about their uses. This is, I think, the most recognizable within the practice of herbalism. Um, First thing that comes to mind is especially Chinese medicine, but we can think of like walnuts. They look like brains, so they're good for your brain. Lungwort looks like lung tissue, so it just so happens to be good for your lungs. The eagle flies highest, so eagle parts carry the power of height, vision, of connection to the sky. The snake sheds its skin, so snake parts carry the power of transformation and renewal. This isn't just poetic, it's a system of reading the world, a way of understanding the natural world as a text that can be interpreted, and a set of correspondences that can actually be worked with. Now, this really goes hand in hand, at least for me, with animism, and is really always a very animistic person, and which this is actually what I could argue is happening in most sophisticated traditions. There are lots of layers to what animism could be, but really the basics are the understanding that the world is full of persons, not always embodied persons, not just human persons, but animal, plant, stone, river, the spirit of even an event happening like thunder and lightning. There's lots of nuances here, but beings with their own agency, their own relationships with the world, and beings that can be communicated with, negotiated with, and worked with. So, under this framework, working with animal material is not just working with the spirit of the animal itself, but perhaps something even deeper. Sometimes for me, it's the spirit of that tooth, the spirit of those hairs that covered the body by the millions, dense and complex with insulating technologies, or claws that dug the earth and soil still stains its deepest crevices. The spirit of the remains become alive and they themselves become conjurable. So this is why in many traditions, the procurement of animal material itself is surrounded by this ritual, by some sort of ritual. You ask permission before you take. You offer something in return. You acknowledge what has been given because you're not just harvesting a resource. Many times this is a transaction or even a relationship that comes to have these obligations. Now, a little bit more history is worth another mention here with Owen Davies and his work on the cunning folk of England. This shows us the same thing in a more domestic register. So, practitioners who worked with animal parts as a matter of course as a part of a practical magical toolkit that was embedded in the rhythms of rural life. The bones left after the pig was butchered, the feathers after the chicken was killed, the fur from the animals that shared the household. These were not exotic ingredients by all means. They were the materials of everyday life, and they were understood to carry power that could be directed. So we have sort of like three frameworks here. There's sympathetic magic at work, the doctrine of signatures, and of course, animism. And I want to suggest that these frameworks are not mutually exclusive, that the most sophisticated way I think to approach this has always been to work with all three simultaneously. Now, you do you, but, moving between them as the working requires. But I would say I'm pretty hard pressed to say that maybe one of these things exists without the other, at least in some form or fashion when working with the spirits themselves with these materials. So when we get into the actual talk about what some of these materials are, let's talk about what bone is first. It's obviously quite the most accessible, osteomancy, there's kits, there's curios. These are pretty um, readily available, especially in most ethical forms. You can easily find someone on Etsy or even within your community who can produce something for you quite ethically. But when it comes to bone itself, it's a composite material. It's roughly 30% collagen, flexible protein matrices, and there's hydroxyapatite. I think that's how you say it. Crystalline calcium, of course. There's these minerals and, all this stuff that combines together and gives bone its extraordinary properties. It's strong enough to bear the weight of a body. It's flexible enough not to shatter under impact and durable enough to survive for hundreds of thousands of years under the right conditions. And of course, I have bones. I have lots of bones. I was definitely that weird kid who opened a shoebox full of bones that I found in the forest and was like, "You want to play with me?" Like super fucking creepy. But I still have some of these really old bones that even was found, and I don't even know how old they are. But it's really remarkable how even with some sun damage, they have this beginning to look like it's made of wood almost. This material really starts to shape and form in a different way over time, but it still persists. So, in the magical thinking, the durability of the bone itself is significant, of course. The bone is what persists. Even if you're cremated, you are just bone powder, essentially, right? The bones are what endure. If the life force of a creature is going to leave a trace in the material world, it's going to leave it in the thing that lasts. This makes bones concentrated. The whole body, flesh, fur, blood from, the soft little bones in the womb that the body builds around, like this carefully curated little puzzle. Then slowly our flesh spoils, it sinks inward, and it returns sender, returns to the vessels of porous bones and sits and waits and ages and eventually crumbles into dust. Smaller pieces of a concentrated spirit of body. The divination of bones are, well, of course, a whole conversation that have their own spotlight, especially on this podcast. But you are not just reading symbols, right? You're listening to what the bones have to say. And the bones in this framework, of course, have something to say. They are not passive, they are not inert, they are objects with presence, with history, with a relationship to the practitioner that develops over time. So, bone is the scaffolding of the body. It's what held the animal upright, what gave it its shape, what made it possible for it to move through the world. The bone is the animal's form made permanent. When you work with a bone, you're working with the form of the creature, with the shape of what it was, and choosing to work with a specific bone is just that more specific. Alligator scutes for armor and protection, phallus bones for working of love and charm and glamour, even fertility, and teeth for even malicious intent. In the traditional crossroads burial, mostly seen in, just general European folk magic, placing a charm or a vessel at a crossroads, often containing bones or other animal material, is a way of, anchoring a working in the liminal space, a space between worlds. The crossroad is where the rules of ordinary reality are thinner, the bones in the vessel are the anchor, and the combination creates a point of contact between, the human world and the whatever lies beyond it, the spirit world, the beyond the veil. Even in the PGM, prescribes bones in necromantic workings with a specificity that makes clear that these are not metaphors. You use the skull of a man who died violently. You use the bones of specific animals for specific purposes. The bone is an active ingredient. It's not a symbol. It does something, it carries something, and it is the material through which the working operates. So there is another aspect to working with bones that I don't see mentioned much, and that's the relational dimension. The bone was part of a being. a specific being with a specific life, a specific history, a very specific relationship with the world. It came from a mother, a father. It most likely bore offspring. It killed, consumed, rested, healed, fought, and loved. When you work with a bone, you're not just working with a substance that has certain properties like feet bones for travel. You're working with the remnant of a relationship. You're working with what's left of a life, where those feet bones specifically took that animal. And that, you know, demands something of you. It demands that you acknowledge what you're holding, that you approach it with respect, and that you understand yourself as being in a relationship with it and not just using it. And that's the weight that I think, I was talking about in the beginning. The weight that isn't just physical, the weight of what the bone is, really all of these material and what it carries. So I think a smooth transition into bone would be now to teeth. And yes, while they are bone, they are used in a very different manner, and their technologies are vastly different as well. Teeth are weapons. They're protection, a tool. They are survival in many cases, and they are the primary instrument of predation, of defense, of the animal's most fundamental relationship with the world around it. Even prey can bite. If nothing else to defend oneself with in the world of the wild, a prey animal can be driven to be unrecognizable in a fit of survival and still deliver a sharp bite. And the tooth is where all of that concentrated force starts to live, the point of contact between the animal's will and the world's resistance. When you work with teeth, you are working with that. You are working with this distilled essence of what it means to be that creature in its most essential moment, the moment of action, of survival, of absolute commitment to forward motion. So, shark teeth are probably among the most recognizable historically and culturally continuous examples of tooth working and magical practice, especially in the Pacific, in Hawaiian, the Maori, the uh, Fijian. I'll pronounce that wrong, but those traditions, shark teeth weapons or ornaments carry a weight that goes far beyond decoration. Shark tooth necklaces worn by warriors and seafarers are protective talismans, yes, but they were also statements of alignment. You are wearing the ocean's apex predator against your skin. And on a little side note, for sharks specifically, but they are really quite remarkable animals. Sharks must keep moving to breathe. Most species, anyway, they cannot stop. They cannot rest in the way of, other creatures rest. Forward motion is not just their preference, it is actually their survival. If the shark stops moving, it dies. They suffocate. They are not just lending this predatory force, but the energy of restlessness, of this relentlessness and necessary forward motion. So, if you are stuck, if you're stagnant, if something in your life has ground to a halt and you need it to move, the truck tooth actually carries some of that help there. It carries that imperative of forward motion encoded in the very biology of the creature it came from. And that is, animals' actual lived reality made portable. So when we talk about the more popular hair, hair, fur, feathers, all the like, hair is the classic contagion material. If you've spent any time reading about sympathetic magic, and if you're listening to this podcast, I suspect you have, you've encountered Fraser's law of contact, once in contact, always in contact. The idea that things which have been connected retain a connection even after physical separation. Hair and fur are the most intuitive, the most visceral expression of that principle. And it is among the most classic, which ingredients, right? Hair grows from a living body. It is produced by that body, shaped by that body's chemistry and genetics and health. It carries the DNA of that creature it came from. When you hold a lock of hair, you are holding something that was until very recently part of that living being. The being still in the hair, not metaphorically, literally in the most material sense. The information of the creature is encoded in what you're holding. So whether you're using hair from your target or you are using hair from animals to help within your working, This can show up in many things, poppet magic, binding, mojo bags, all sorts of working materials of cunning folk across centuries and continents. It's a thread, sometimes literally, that connects the working to its target. So, other than just including hair as this tag lock for a target within your work, it can be used as an essential mechanism. Think knotwork or binding, incorporating braided hair or cord. This acts of interweaving of tying adds the element of working something inward or outward, depending on how you braid it, but it is usually the element of constraint, of wrapping them up in something. Now, with animal fur, and here I'm drawing on both Native American traditions and Siberian shamanism, which share certain structural similarities despite their large geographic distance. Animal fur integrated into ceremonial costume is not decoration and it is not metaphor. One of the things I think of, I believe it's in Siberia, is like that amazing festival of bears where they have the bear pelts and they're dancing. And I don't know too much about it, so I'm not going to talk on it, but it's really cool to see. But when this medicine elder, this shaman, wears a garment incorporating, say, wolf fur or bear fur or feathers or fur of their particular animal uh, helpers, I guess, they are wearing the presence of that animal. The fur is the animal's presence made wearable. It is becoming a part of their body or a portion of it, brought into contact with the practitioner's body. The boundary between the human and the animal becomes permeable, and the shaman can access the animal's perception, the power, the way of moving through the world, because the animal is, in a very real sense, on them, really fits perfectly. When, we talked about shapeshifting, right, in the previous episode. But Emma Wilby's work on familiar spirits in early modern British witchcraft actually touches on this in a pretty fascinating way. The animal form of the familiar, so the toad, the cat, the hare, the dog, is sometimes physically represented in the practitioner's tools and clothing. The familiar's presence is not only spiritual, it has material dimension. And fur, hair, feathers, they are materials through which that material dimension is expressed. So, what species matters enormously. And this is where the doctrine of signatures becomes genuinely useful as this framework to sort of follow. The animal's nature is readable in its coat. Rabbit fur carries luck and fertility. The rabbit is the creature of abundance, of rapid multiplication, of the earth's generosity. Wolf fur carries protection of ferocity. The threshold guardian, the pack defender, fox fur carries cunning and misdirection. The fox, is generally a trickster, the creature that survives by being smarter than the thing hunting it, by doubling back, by making you look the wrong way. Now, feathers are the material of flight. So they are the interface of between the bird and the sky, the structure that makes the impossible possible, that takes a creature of flesh and bone and blood and lifts it into the air. Feathers have felt the wind, the very edges of the atmosphere that we cannot ourselves. Feathers carry this connection to the other world through flight, through dreams, the astral, physically owls and ravens taking witches and witches turning into owls, these night stalking predators of flight, silent, swift, and unseen. Feathers placed under pillows for prophetic dreams, a bridge to this dream world, even feathers incorporated into amulets for travel for speech, because, the feather as the thing that moves through the air, that carries sound, that makes communication possible. Of course, which avian you possess a feather from matters greatly, and please, please, please be mindful of your local laws and regulations here. But the magical logic of feathers, when you sit with it, is really about interface. The feather is the part of the bird that makes flight possible. But more than that, it is the part of the bird that is in constant contact with the air. The feather is always touching the sky. It is the membrane between, this earthly and the aerial, between the grounded and the elevated, from what we can see from where we stand and what becomes visible when we rise. Now, working with feathers is working with that specific interface. It is working with the ability to move between states, between this earthly dimension and the spiritual, the waking world and your dream world, and even the living and the dead, if you choose to use it in a more necromantic sense. But generally, they have this capacity to carry messages across those boundaries, to rise above the immediate and see from a higher perspective, to access the aerial view that changes everything about how you understand what's below you. So, finding feathers is, sort of its own practice. And most of us who work with found feathers, feathers that come to us, that appear in our path, that seem to be waiting for us in a way that feels like more than a coincidence. And across traditions, finding a feather itself is usually a sign of some sort of communication. Now, of course, sometimes, bitch, it is just a feather. Okay, sometimes it is just a feather. But read into it how you will, where your intuition guides you. Maybe you just simply collect them. So now let's talk about claws, because just like teeth, it's nearly a available tool for every animal that we can think of, whether it is for defense or not. Now, the claw can be this instrument of both destruction and healing. I always try to recognize what these claws might have actually been used for, other than the general scratching and walking trouble work. While that is useful and while traditional is traditional, building a deeper relationship with such materia is rewarding in the sense that you sometimes feel like you've accessed this hidden little code. Things like coyote claws or badger claws, something that burrows for homes, for denning, this home protection, or even invisibility sense of protection, since most of the time these dens were meant to be discreet. If you want your home to be generally hidden in plain sight, or um, using it in some sort of other invisibility working, or even, some big cat claws use their claws to mark their territory, to announce or broadcast their presence, this sort of graffiti working. Now, when it comes to the less talked about materia like saliva, excrement, urine, the effluvia, if you will, which is discharge or fluid of some sort. Of course, we have talked about the oh so holy, which is water, in the saliva episode, but what about using animal saliva? I want to push back gently on this idea that the magical logic and the physical reality are as far apart as we might assume. So let's start with basics. Dog saliva. This dog saliva does contain some antimicrobial compounds. It contains lysosome. It contains immunoglobulins. It contains compounds that have genuine antibacterial properties. Now, other than the physicality of it, the ancient understanding that a dog licking a wound was doing something real, that understanding was not wrong. It was arrived at through a different framework, through a different epistemology, but the observation was accurate. The dog saliva was doing something right. There is a sort of power, to be withheld within the taboo traditions. What is forbidden, what crosses the boundary of the acceptable, what transgresses. The material carries charge precisely because of that transgression. The boundary itself is a source of power. What lives on the other side of the boundary, what has been placed outside the circle of acceptable, carries the energy of that exclusion. And excrement is transgressive in a very specific way. It is what the body has taken in, processed completely, and expelled. It has been inside, it has been transformed by the body's alchemy, and then it has been cast out, placed outside the boundary for the self, outside the boundary of the acceptable, outside the boundary of the clean. The process, ingestion, transformation, expulsion, it is a complete cycle. And the material that results from that cycle carries the genuine signature of everything that went into it. Now, I don't just want to talk about, using shit and magic for the sake of using it, but Harry Middleton Hyatt's field notes, I want to be very clear that Hyatt was a meticulous documentarian, episcopal minister who spent decades collecting this material with genuine respect for the practitioners he interviewed. But his field notes include recipes and practitioner testimony involving excrement and urine for marking, for fetishes, for curse work, for protection. Now, animal dung in conjure appears in both aggressive and protective contexts: to ward a space, to mark a boundary, to curse someone who has crossed you, to protect what is yours. The logic is very consistent. The material carries the animal's essence in a form that has been fully processed, fully transformed. It is the animal's metabolism made external. And, there's something about the fact of expulsion, the actual action of it, of casting out, that makes, these materials particularly suited to workings of banishment, of a boundary setting, of sending something away. And maybe this is to educate you on how you could be inspired to broaden your uses or materia, or, what, even fuck it, just go outside and stand with a bowl trying to catch some bird shit from a crow or vulture. I don't care. But there are more whole things that we could also work with, right? Think paws, feet, hooves, tongues, organs, we'll get into organs, the parts of a creature that touch the earth, that carry the body forward, that leave a mark in the mud or the snow or dust of a road. Feet are instruments of contact. They are the point where the animal meets the world. So I'm sure you already know of the rabbit's foot. Even if you've never done a day of magical practice in your life, you know the rabbit's foot. You've seen them at gas stations, maybe dyed neon pink or electric blue, dangling from a little keychain clip. Maybe you even had one as a kid. Maybe you thought it was a little morbid and a little silly, and you carried it anyway because something in you understood on some level that it maybe meant something. The rabbit's foot as a formal magical curio has deep roots in American folk magic and is, well, almost certainly the most widely recognized animal part charm in the entire tradition. But the traditional workings is not just any rabbit's foot. And I believe this comes from hoodoo roots with its specificity on the left hind foot. And it is taken from a rabbit killed under very particular conditions, like in a cemetery or at a crossroads on specifically Friday during a new moon or full moon, or I've seen even maybe dark moon, or by a cross eyed person. Some versions of the tradition require several of these conditions to be met simultaneously. The more liminal the circumstances, the more potent the charm. It's almost like if this thing was caught and gathered while all these really rare things were happening simultaneously, like, damn, that must be really lucky, right? So there's that form of sympathetic magic there too, where it actually becomes embedded into the tool because of the ways that it was obtained. So the use of chicken feet charms are also pretty recognizable, especially within the hoodoo framework and the further adapted American folk traditions. But you'll find them hung above doorways, tucked into corners, worked into protective arrangements for the home. The chicken foot is used in both, crossing and uncrossing work. It can be deployed to lay a trick on someone, and it can be used to sweep that trick away. There's something in, the chicken foot that operates at the threshold of the home that guards the point of entry and exit. Chickens scratch away at the ground, right? Roosters have their spurs. So that's where that sort of logic comes in. Now, bird feet in general appear in folk charms across, a remarkable range of traditions, and the logic shifts depending on the bird. So, bird feet are instruments of grasping. Talons can catch, claws that hold, toes that grip a branch or a wire or a piece of prey. They are also instruments of landing, of the moment when the aerial creature touches the earth. Bird feet also appear in, hunting charms and in what we call seed time omens. So the feet of certain birds used to divine the success of planting season or carried by hunters for luck in the field. The foot of the bird that catches its prey becomes a charm for the human who wants to catch theirs. Organ for organ, function for function. Now, tongues and other organs. The tongue is, the organ of speech. It is the instrument that makes language physical. It takes the thought, the intention, the word, and gives it sound and shape in the world. Now, when talking about the magics of the situation, speech is not merely communication. Speech is power. The word creates, the name binds, the curse lands, the blessing holds. Language is enchantment. The word spell means both the magical working and the arrangement of letters. Grammar and grimoire share a root. Charm comes from the Latin carmen, which means song, incantation, the spoken word as magical act. Language is the oldest magic that we have, and the tongue is the instrument that performs it. Most available is the cow tongue. Usually the tongue becomes this proxy for the human tongue or your target. And what you do to the proxy, you do to the original. You fill it with ingredients that cause, closing bitterness, gagging silence. You sew it shut, you freeze it, and the person whose name is inside cannot speak against you. That's simply just one example, but this idea of they cannot testify, they cannot gossip, cannot lie about you in court, cannot open their mouth and do you harm. But of course, the tongue is only one organ. And once you start thinking about organs as magical instruments, once you accept the logic that the tongue carries the power of speech, that working with it gives you access to that power, you have to follow that logic all the way through because, every organ carries something. Every organ is the seat of a particular capacity, a particular force, a particular quality of being. And, this is the doctrine of signatures applied not to only plants, not to stones, but to the interior of the body itself. The organ signifies its function. The organ is its function made flesh, and if you want to work with that function, to invoke it, to bind it, to transfer it, to amplify it, you can work with other organs. Now, yes, if you're squeamish, well, I'm surprised you're still here, but you can kindly skedaddle now if such topics make you uncomfy. But on the topic of organs, let's start with the liver because the liver has one of the most extraordinary histories in the entire story of magical practice. And most people have no idea when it comes to the divinatory uses of the liver. So in ancient Mesopotamia, we're talking Babylon, we're talking Assyria, the civilizations that gave us the first written records of organized magical and divinatory practice, the liver was understood as the seat of the soul, not the heart, the liver. The liver was where emotion lived, where decision lived, where the messages of the gods arrived and could be read. And so the practice of hepatoscopy, divination by the inspection of animal livers, became one of the most institutionalized, most technically sophisticated forms of divination in the ancient world. Used specialists trained for years. There were handbooks. There were clay liver models, actual three-dimensional clay models of sheep livers inscribed with regions and meanings, used to train apprentice diviners in the art of reading what the organ revealed. We still have those models. They did survive. The Babylonian clay liver models are in museum collections, and they're really extraordinary objects, not just as historical artifacts, of course, but as evidence of how seriously, how systematically, how rigorously these practitioners took the idea that the organ was a map, that the liver of a sacrificed animal was a microcosm of the cosmos, and that reading it correctly would tell you what the cosmos intended. The Etruscans inherited this tradition and made it their own. The liver of Piacenza, an Etruscan bronze model of a sheep's liver discovered in northern Italy in 1877, is divided into regions, each inscribed with the name of a deity. It is a cosmological map, if you will, in the shape of an organ. So the haruspices, the Etruscan, and later Roman diviners who read livers were not performing superstition. They were practicing a sophisticated interpretive system of, that the Roman state took pretty seriously enough to even consult before major military and political decisions for centuries. The magical logic here is really the same logic that we've been tracing all episode. The liver is the seat of feeling, of decision, of the soul's reception of divine communication. Therefore, the liver is the instrument through which that communication can be read. The organ carries the function can be accessed through the organ. Now, bile, this is a whole different matter. The bitter secretion of the liver stored in the gallbladder carries its own distinct magical logic. Now, there is a bunch of history here when it comes to bile, but bile is the liver's most concentrated product. It is the distillation of everything the liver processes, rendered into something intensely, almost unbearably bitter, and that bitterness is itself a magical signature. In traditional Chinese medicine, animal bile, bear bile, ox bile, just a few examples, have been used for thousands of years for conditions described as excess heat, inflammation, conditions of the liver and gallbladder meridians. The bitter cooling quality actually of bile is understood as its therapeutic action. So it purges, it clears, it cuts through what has been accumulated and shouldn't be there. And what can purge the physical can in turn purge the spiritual. So, in European humoral tradition, bile was one of the four humors: yellow bile, black bile, each associated with specific temperaments, specific emotional states, specific tendencies of character. The word bilious still carries that meaning, irritable, caustic, difficult. So, that caustic quality makes bile a natural ingredient for workings such as reversal, of souring, of cutting through sweetness and turning it bitter. So if you want to, for example, sour a relationship, if you want to introduce this bitterness where there was sweetness, if you want to purge something that has taken root where it shouldn't be, bile carries that property. It is the body's own instrument of bitterness, and bitterness in magical logic is it's a force. It's not just, a flavor. Now, the heart is the organ that, of course, everyone knows is magical. Even people who have never thought about magic in their lives, we speak of courage as having a heart. We speak of love as living in the heart. We speak of will and intention and the deepest commitments of a person as matters of the heart. And this is, rather very literal. That was once a precise description of where these things were understood to live. So the heart of an animal can be used in workings for, courage, for love, for binding, for the transfer of vital force. The logic is direct. The heart is the seat of these qualities, just as the liver was the seat of their own qualities. Working with the heart gives you, of course, access to them. Now, on the subject of eyes, the eye is, of course, the organ of sight, but in magical traditions, sight is never only physical. The eye sees the visible world, yes, but the eye is also the instrument of the evil eye, which, yes, we have talked about. So, you meet the gaze with the gaze. The apotropaic eye symbol is, of course, one of the oldest and most widespread protective devices in human history, and it is grounded in the understanding that the eye is not a passive receiver of light. It is an active instrument. It projects, it touches, and it can wound. Now, of course, animal eyes can carry the same technology. The eye of a predator, a hawk, an eagle, a cat carries the quality of that animal's vision. Hawk sees from a height that no human can access. The cat sees in darkness. The eagle sees detail at distances that seem impossible. Now, working with these eyes or with representations of them is working with those qualities of perception, with the ability to see what others cannot see, to perceive what is hidden, and to look clearly at what others look away from. So within scrying, the eye is the instrument of inner vision. The crystal ball, the dark mirror, the bowl of water are all services that the eye uses to access what lies beyond ordinary sight. The animal eye, in this context, becomes a kind of lens, a way of sharpening or extending the practitioner's own perceptual capacity. Now, I do want to mention fat in grease here too, because, that flies under the radar quite a bit. Animal fat, bear grease, goose fat, the rendered substance of the animal's body, that stored energy of its life. Fat has a specific and fascinating history in European and magical practice because fat is the base of the flying ointment, the very famous flying ointment. While, traditionally tallow from bovine was mostly used, the nasty little book of Hammer of Witches describes witches using fat from even little babies. But, bear grease also deserves a mention here because, yes, while bovine was popular and a part of everyday life, so was bear grease, used in hair preparations and protective salves, in remedies for joint pain and cold. The bear's fat carries the bear's qualities: warmth, endurance, the capacity to survive the winter, the stored energy of a creature that lives off its own reserves for months at a time. Now, goose fat, fat from a cat, the fat of very specific animals chosen for their, of course, magical correspondences. These appear in the recipe literature of early modern Europe with a very distinct way that tells us these practitioners or cunning folk were not simply using whatever it was available. They were actually choosing. They were selecting based on the qualities of the animal on the doctrine of signatures applied to the animal's stored energy. Now, of course, when it comes to sourcing these things, when it comes to fat, the easiest way to source fat would just be, sourcing tallow from, if you're a meat eater, if you have this accessible to you, if you're trimming pieces of meat, if you actually do hunt yourself. Um, Personally, I find the best way is just to render and process any sort of tallow or fat on really your own accord. So, on the subject of sourcing and gathering and ethics, let's actually get into the ethics of this whole conversation. That is for entertainment purposes only. If you were to hypothetically and always source ethically, but if you're going to work with animal material, really work with it, not just collect pretty things for your altar, then you need to really think seriously about where those materials come from, what it costs for them to exist in your hands, and what you owe in return. Historically, practitioners source their materials through hunting, like I just mentioned, through even sacrificial kill in the times where that was very common, through the byproducts of household slaughter, the bones left after the pig was butchered, the feathers after the chicken was killed for Sunday's dinner. They gathered from even graves, they scavenged from roadsides and fields, they worked with what the world offered them, and they worked with it consciously within ritual frameworks and that acknowledged what had happened. An animal had died, something had been taken. The magic required that acknowledgement. And we've lost a lot of that directness. Most of us don't slaughter our own food. That's just the truth of it. Most of us don't hunt. Most of us are several steps removed from the death that sustains us. And that distance has made us, I guess, squeamish in ways that our ancestors simply weren't. And it's something that I think the system is obviously very trying to continue to remove us from. But that squeamishness, while understandable, has made us less honest, even if we're not trying to be. It's just kind of a byproduct of what is happening. Less clear eyed about what we're actually doing when we work with animal material. So let's start to be more clear eyed. In a modern world, there are several sourcing frameworks that I think hold up really ethically, and I want to walk through them. The first and most straightforward is naturally shed material. So, feathers that fall from living birds, antler velvet, claw sheaths. Cats shed these regularly, shed snakeskin, fur that comes off in a brush, hair. These materials carry the animal's essence without requiring its death or harm. Now, do be careful. Again, I know some stuff, depending on where you live, you aren't even allowed to possess it, even if you just found it. But I digress. You know, these gifts freely given, in the most literal sense. If you have animal companions even in your life, you have access to a steady supply of this kind of material, and it is some of the most potent that you can work with because the relationship is already there. Even using magical means to treasure hunt for these things are an option and a very reliable one that I might argue. So the second is, of course, roadkill. An animal that has been struck by a vehicle is an animal that has already died. Its death was not caused by you. Its remains left on the road will be consumed by scavengers or simply decay. If you collect those remains with care and intention, you are not causing harm. You are honoring what is already gone. Personally, I've processed my fair share of animal materia really from a pretty young age, as I used to want to be a professional taxidermist. And well, not coming from sources where material was available to me, either budget wise or by my own means. My family doesn't hunt. So we strongly believe in the practice of hunting for survival and using the whole animal, but I often resorted to what I found, what I scavenged for, and came across what showed up for me from which had already passed. Now, again, on the legal matter, roadkill collection in some jurisdictions and not in others, they really vary. In the United States, at least, these laws vary by state. Some have explicit roadkill salvage laws that allow you to collect certain species, others don't. Of course, look into your local law before you stop and pick anything. And again, like I said, some species are protected regardless of how they died, and beyond the legal. There's the cultural, even. Some animals' material carry deep significance within indigenous traditions. Certain feathers, certain bones, certain ceremonial objects are not simply decorative or magical in a generic sense. They are sacred within specific living traditions and traditions that have been actively suppressed and stolen from. So just being mindful and respecting, these certain indigenous cultural protocols around these materials is not just a legal question. It's mostly a question of basic human decency. But another way to source some of these material are butcher byproducts. Now, especially if you have international markets near you, this is a wonderful way to get it. Tongues, feet, bones, organs. These are animals that have already been killed for food. Using their remains in magical practice is not adding to their death. It's honoring their fullness of what they gave. A chicken foot from a butcher shop is a chicken that died to feed someone regardless. Using that foot in a working is a way of saying, nothing about this animal is waste. Everything has its value. This is, in many ways, the most ancient sourcing framework of all because, the magical use of slaughter byproducts is really documented across many cultures that kept domestic animals. So then, more like oddly, is the collection of antiques and museum quality curios, items with provenance, a Victorian taxidermy piece, a 19th century apothecary specimen. Now, a piece that has been, separated from its source by decades or centuries, the ethical weight here is different. You didn't cause this animal's death, or neither did anyone currently living. What you're working with is a historical object, and your relationship to it is one of stewardship. While you might just kind of use these things for less direct workings, I guess, maybe even just for creating your altar space or building a connection with it and not really putting it into a real living working, they're still worth a mention. So, underneath all of these frameworks is something that I think the real heart of the ethics conversation. And it comes from Marion Green, whose work on natural magic I find consistently grounding. Green talks about reverence and reciprocity as the foundational principles of working with the natural world. And what that means practically is the animal gave something, whether it gave a shed feather or its entire life, it gave something. That gift carries obligation. You are not simply a consumer of magical supplies, you are in a relationship. So, what does that relationship actually require of you? Well, it requires that you use what you take, requires that you work with intention and care. It requires that you acknowledge in your practice what the animal was, not just what it can do for you. And it requires that you think about what happens when the working is done. Because this is, something that doesn't get talked about, and that is the disposal. What you do with animal material when the working is complete, when the talisman has served its purpose, or when the bones have been cast for the last time, when the working is closed, no matter what it looks like, if you are to dispose your um, material after the working instead of if it's not specifically a working materia that you use over and over, you should ideally return the material to earth. You inter it, you bury it, you ideally in a place that feels appropriate to the working. You can burn it if that's appropriate or scatter the ash. You return it to running water. The specific method matters less than intention. Uh, this material came from the living world. It served its purpose in the working. Of course, again, use discretion. Don't go put some invasive species remains in something that's going to ultimately affect the environment in a really harmful way. Um, really just think about what it means to release and dispose of any working materia, but uh, approach it slightly differently here because it is a matter of a different sort of spirit. This is a matter of both magical hygiene and ethical practice. It's magical hygiene because leaving old workings open, leaving charged materials sitting around indefinitely creates this energetic clutter and sort of confusion. And it's ethical practice because it completes the cycle. The animal gave, you received, you used, and you return. That is a complete relationship. And that's how, this is remotely supposed to work. What I would really want you to take from all of this, from the liver to the bile to the heart to the eyes to the nasty little liquids and discharges to the fat, is a single coherent principle. And that is the body is not a collection of interchangeable parts. Every organ is the seat of a specific capacity, a specific force, and a quality of being. The traditions that, we talked about today, or if you even go and explore, understand this with extraordinary precision, and they built their practices around it. They worked with the organ that carried the quality they needed, they worked with the body's own logic. These are not just ingredients, they are not just supplies to stock your home apothecary with or a collection for the magic or aesthetics of it. They are presences, they are beings or the remains of beings who have something to offer you, for which an ingredient is passive. An ingredient sits in a jar and kind of waits to be used and activated. An ingredient has almost no stake in the outcome, right? No relationship to to the practitioner, not as loud of a voice, I would say, on how it's deployed. This is the animist heart of everything that we've been talking about today. When you work with animal materia, from this understanding, from the understanding that you are working with the residue of a personhood, the remains of a being who had its own stake in the world, the work changes, it deepens, it becomes a conversation rather than a procedure. And there is a version of contemporary witchcraft that has become, despite its best intentions, a little too clean, a little too aesthetic, and too concerned with the beautiful arrangement of things on an altar and not quite concerned enough with what those things actually are, what they carry, what they ask of us. And and I understand how that happened. You know, the sanitization of witchcraft is partly a survival strategy, partly a response to centuries of persecution, partly the natural result of the tradition trying to find its footing in a world that is deeply uncomfortable with the primal and the animal and the dark, and really just evolution of time, but which is historically, cross culturally, in the deep grain of what this practice actually is. Witches are not clean, witches are not tidy, they are not careful, curated aesthetic of a flat lay photograph. We are primal creatures. We are rough and graceful at the same time, like every animal that has ever survived in a world that was trying to kill it. We are survivors. We carry in our bodies the accumulated wisdom of every ancestor who made it through the winter, who found food where there was none, who knew which plants would heal and which would harm, and who sat with the dying and the dead and were not destroyed by it. To embody the witch is to embody being human, and being human is innately animal. And the great forgetting of our culture, you know, the great wound of modernity, is the belief that we have transcended that, that we are above it, that our animal nature is something to be managed or overcome or hidden away. And we are not above it. We are in it and we are of it. And the work of this practice, underneath all the technique and the history and the correspondence tables, is the work of remembering that, of coming back into right relationship with the animal world, of acknowledging that we are not the masters of this world, not the owners of it, not even the apex of some hierarchy that places us above the creatures whose bones and feathers and claws we work with. We share their calcium, their keratin, their iron. We share their hunger and their fear and their fierce embodied will to survive, and we will work with their remains. And when we work with them, we hold their bones, their teeth, their feathers. We are not reaching down to pick up a tool. We are reaching across to touch a relative. And working with animal material is a practice of remembering that. It's a practice of relationship with the more than human world, with the dead, with the living, with the forces that move through all bodies. When you hold a bone, you're holding something that was once alive, that breathed and moved and felt, that was part of the same web of life that you are part of. Now, I hope this conversation was of use to you. I want to thank all of you for sticking with me to the end if you're here still. And of course, I hope you found at least one thing that was useful in today's conversation. Uh, you know, when it comes to animal materia, other than just the creative and historical ways we can look at how they were used, how we can use it, I really want to get to the heart in this episode, and that was just the pure understanding of uh, that we are a part of this animal world as well. Now, that was my little rant on everything animal materia and using it within your craft, and maybe some things even deeper than that. Again, thank you for listening, and as usual, wherever you are in the world, I hope you have a wonderful morning, day, or night.